It is our pleasure to have our expert, Dr. Chandra Ghosh Ippen. Dr. Chandra Ghosh Ippen is a child trauma psychologist specializing in working with families with children under age of 6. She's the co-developer of Child Parent Psychotherapy Program and Associate Director of the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California, San Francisco. She has spent over 30 years conducting clinical work, research, and training in the area of childhood trauma and diversity-informed practice. She's also an award-winning children's book author and has written 5 children's books, as well as the free Trinka and Sam disaster series, which has been translated and distributed to over 400,000 families around the world. With this, we'll hand it over to Dr. Ghosh Ippen.
Thank you so much, Eileen. So I wish that I could see everybody, but I'm going to imagine what you look like, and I'm hopefully going to imagine that you are smiling and you are with me. And I'm going to share my screen. It's a little embarrassing to be called an expert, but I think what I am is a translator. And in terms of disclosures, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm a 0 to 3 board member, and I have my children's book company, Piplo Productions, and I have no other disclosures. But I wanted to really acknowledge that I am a learner and that I've had the good fortune of being part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I've left you some links in case you choose to learn more about stress and trauma, and they have wonderful free webinars. I've also been a learner through my work with child parent psychotherapy, and really in collaboration with Dr. Alicia Lieberman, who developed the model, and with all of the CPP trainers. And you can see a map here of our disseminations around the country and also around the state of California. So I wanted to start off by sharing what I call the ABCs of a trauma-informed response, because I typically want to share everything I've learned in the last 30 years with any group that I'm sitting with. And so I had to gel it down to what is the core. And so the A stands for acknowledge, and we acknowledge what children go through, we acknowledge what families go through, what cultural groups have gone through and continue to go through, and what we as providers go through as we hear these stories. The B stands for bodies and breath, and we remember the words of Bessel van der Kolk, who taught us that the body keeps the score, and think about how responses to danger are rooted in our neurobiology and in our bodies. And the C stands for connect, and you're going to see that I'm cheating a little because I actually have a lot of C's and connections that I'm hoping that we'll all make. But I'm going to start with the child-parent psychotherapy triangle. And so if you're thinking of this triangle, on the right-hand side, what we're going to start with is behavior and feelings. And you can think of that as the things that might bring us down or families down. The child is hitting or kicking or not speaking much or any of those things. And on the left-hand side of that triangle, we're actually going to try to start with a little bit of curiosity in terms of wondering, I wonder what brought them there. I wonder what that path was that they traveled so that their behavior and feelings and where they are right now makes complete and total sense. Now, on the bottom of this, we're going to put our plan. How might we help you? How might we support you as we acknowledge what you've been through and what it's resulted in? And around this, we're going to put protective steps and hope, all the good things that you're doing, including that you are coming and looking for help and support. Now, we do this to build loving connection among families, and I've put these beautiful pictures up here, and I think it's very hard for me to say, but what happens if there has been an experience of danger in this family? And what happens, for example, if there has been an experience of separation? Because many of us might like to believe that the children are too young and will be somehow protected. And what I would say is the first, going back to the A, what we want to acknowledge is actually the children are not too young. And in fact, being young, when things happen, they have deep questions inside, like, will it happen again? Is this what always happens? Why did you leave me? Why did these things happen? And they don't always have the capability to say that in words. And so they say it in behavior. And so we want to start by acknowledging that what happens actually forms the template for what they're learning about the world and about relationships. But it also means that when we acknowledge and when we open the door to a dialogue at their level, we can promote healing. Now, as we think about building connections in a trauma-informed system, one of the things that we might really want to change is the way that we partner together, and that we have often operated in silos. And we're going to start thinking together about why in a trauma-informed system, it's critical that we have collaboration and connection among us. And then again, the ABCs, I added an S, and that would be that really if trauma is about danger and the body's response and memory of danger, then what we're really focusing on is safety and protection and how to restore and to repair, the body's sense of danger by acknowledging that that is what the body remembers. Now, I put this picture here because I'm a therapist. I'm a therapist, a supervisor, and a trainer. But, I work with children who are under age 6 who have often experienced very difficult things. But when we think about mental health, this is often the number one reason for why a parent might bring a child into treatment. And if you see here, we can see that the child is having a tantrum, and we might imagine, where is this happening? That it could be happening, in our clinics. The parent could be telling us about this. It could be happening in Target. It could be happening in our own homes. And we as adults, we often don't think of it this way, but we have theories. We have, if you think about, here is the right-hand side of the triangle, the child is tantruming, and the theory is what goes on the left-hand side. And so I might ask, what is our theory? And if we were in a room together talking about this, we could see that there are many different theories. And if you go back to that triangle, depending on your theory, you have a very different plan. And so, for example, I worked with a child who was having great difficulty, and the first person who was on the scene was the nutritionist. And the nutritionist did a very good history and suggested to the parent that it was really the diet and the sugar. Now, I would say that that nutritionist had the power of what I call first theory, because when a parent is desperate, sometimes the first person to give them a good idea, that's the theory that they hold on to. And in this case, mom was very concerned about the sugar, and in fact, to such a degree that it caused added stress in her relationship with her partner. Now, when we started working with her, what we learned is that there were some kind of important dietary considerations, and that's very important because of myelination in the early years in terms of thinking about your neurons. But what we also learned is that the parents were fighting at least once a week with some domestic violence. And so that was something that we want to have in our work, the and of how do we understand, that it might be that and something else. All right, so as we continue with this, just thinking about our different theories, I just want to share something that I thought was really funny. Years ago, I got to speak with some doctors at Kaiser Hospital, and I put up this slide and I said, what is your theory? And the very first thing that someone said was that their theory was appendicitis. And I thought, wow, that is so wise, because coming from where you are, you have to rule out a medical cause. And I thought, and that's so funny because I would have never come up with that theory. And I said, what's your next theory? And they said, lead paint. And I thought, wow, that is also so wise and so interesting, because you would be, ruling this out, which is really smart, but I would be going with other theories. And I just want to think about how if you think a child is hungry, we feed them. If you think a child is overwhelmed by sensory motor integration difficulties, like the lights are too loud, we might think about turning down the volume and stimulating this child less. If we think that this child is having a tantrum because they're 3 years old, we might think about their language difficulties, that they can't express themselves, and we might actually encourage the grown-up to speak more. So as you look at this, and if you spend more time with this than I'm spending right now, you might discover that in some cases, depending on our theory, we might give people completely opposite suggestions. And so let's just, let's think about this, and let's think about different theories that can come into play with different children. And so I wanted to bring this into a family that any of us might work with. So we'll think about Gabriel, and he identifies as a boy, and he's actually Latino, Native American, and white. And he might come to the attention of mental health, unfortunately, at about age 5. And people might be saying that he has aggressive behavior, difficulty focusing, difficulty staying still, and learning challenges. And if I got a good history, I might learn that his problem started in preschool, where his preschool teacher was concerned that he had ADHD and noted that he didn't focus and didn't sit still during circle time, didn't listen to his teachers, and hit and kicked another teacher. And he was actually suspended from preschool after he kicked a teacher who intervened during one of his fights. And we should all hold that the number one time when a child gets suspended from school is preschool. And we should think about that and think about how we can really support systems in doing better for children, in particular children of color who are disproportionately suspended and having disciplinary actions as early and even earlier than preschool. Now, if we went back and got even more of a history, we might learn that at age 2, it was his pediatrician who was concerned. And that in this case, the pediatrician was hearing that he had speech and motor delays. And so he was referred for early intervention services. And the pediatrician reported that mom was very worried about his temper tantrums, was overwhelmed, and said he was always a difficult baby. And so just to think about the different theories these different service providers might have and the different people who are involved in his care. And I want you to notice that everything that I've mentioned so far is really the right-hand side of the triangle. And what we really might be wondering about is, what is our theory here? And we have all of these people, and what's our plan? And here I'm thinking about all of the medical providers who were surrounding this family. We had medical providers, education, mental health, and early intervention. And what happens to a family when we don't agree? So each circle here is reflecting our perspective, with the idea being, are we in overlap, like on the right? So we might be suggesting a similar thing. Or is the family in the middle, hearing very different things? And in a trauma-informed system, what might we all put in our intersections? So might we put this question: how might experiences of stress and danger be affecting what we're now seeing, feeling, and responding to? And when we ask this question, we might think about danger as experienced by the person, the child, by Gabriel, as experienced by his family, and as experienced by the cultural group. And we might even think as experienced by us as providers. Now, and what we might want to start with is some curiosity and compassion. And really, I think about, how might I earn the right to hear the family's story? And so how might I, and I recognize that this is hard in a lot of systems, but slow things down so that I might hear that story. And I'm going to share the mantra that SAMHSA has adopted from the sanctuary model, which is, it's not what's wrong with him, it's what happened to him. And it's also what's right with him. And what I might hear if I slowed things down is that I might hear that when he was born, he had birth complications and he had medical interventions and he was in the NICU, and that his mom had postpartum depression. And that actually, if I think about what does this mean, I want to hold the words of Dr. Robert Pinus, who is the head of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And he taught me that if you really want to understand how trauma affects a young child, what you need to do is the kind of nasty task of shrinking yourself down to their size at the age of which they experience the danger and walking it through at their size and level, thinking about what the family is sharing with you. And so there's, of course, a little bit of fact and a little bit of fantasy. But if I think about what Gabriel went through, I would learn that he was in the NICU and he was intubated. And so here he is, he's born into the world, and all of a sudden he's immobilized. And if you imagine a little body that cannot move, and lights and noises are going off, and that is happening heroically because medical providers are saving his life, which is amazing. And at the same time that we are working to do that, I think we can all see that he is having a sense of danger in his body also. It's an and that when people approach his body, Gabriel, even being a baby, especially being a baby, might expect that we might poke or pinch him, or because we have to get blood, we have to do procedures, and he might worry, and his body might naturally pull away like this, right? Now, that's what Gabriel was doing because his body was worried. He had trauma-related expectations about feeling danger. And unfortunately, his history collided with his mother's history. So his mother was an immigrant who had come here from Mexico. She had come fleeing some very significant violence. And when she had come here, she had unfortunately had to leave her older child with her mother because they couldn't make the passage together. And so when she had Gabriel, she was both delighted, but she was also feeling really guilty. And she was feeling like she wasn't a very good mother. And can you see how when her child unfortunately pulled away from her, she might have seen it as confirmation of, see, I'm not a very good mother. And in fact, I'm cursed. And so it makes all the sense in the world, if you think about her triangle, that she became depressed. And in fact, we often don't talk about this, but Gabriel's dad also became depressed when we think about postpartum depression, because he was really concerned about his child and the bills and what it would be like to have a child who had significant medical challenges. And he needed support as well. Now, as this continued, one of the metaphors that I often use is that we think about these things happening to families, and it's as if they're in pressure cookers and they get squeezed. And sometimes what happens is, unfortunately, that's where we see the stress, and it causes conflict among loved ones, and that they did fight, and Gabriel's dad did hit mom, and that, he also needed to both be helped and supported, and for that to also, for the return to safety for that family. And Gabriel ended up seeing his dad get arrested. He was separated from his father, who was at times violent, but who was also a loving father. And it's hard to hold those two things in mind, but I have learned that that is what children are often holding in mind, is that sort of nuance, complexity of how can this person that I love also be this person that does this? And so as you continue down here, I want you to see how we can easily make connections between how Gabriel is showing up, how his families are showing up. I'm doing that right-hand side of the triangle, and what they went through. And then if you combine that with poverty, housing instability, and sociocultural trauma, and that all this was happening at the same time that families like theirs were being separated at the border. And so thinking about, is it safe to get services? Is it safe to come in? That really creating a context where their symptoms were exacerbated. So I'm just wanting to, think with you. I'm imagining, if we think about A, acknowledge, B, bodies, that even as we hear this, our own bodies, and I know I can't see your bodies, but that they might be feeling this. And so if that is happening, just want you to send, to acknowledge, to feel it, and, to think about how this work does affect us in hearing this. And I'm going to risk a little bit. I want to move to some core concepts, because how do we understand what might have happened, and how do we understand how it might have affected Gabriel and his family as well? And so this is actually taken from a much longer training that I do called the ripple effect. And in that training, I have these different visual balls that carry core concepts. And today I'm only going to play with two of them, but I'm going to throw this one up there. This one carries some of the core trauma concepts related to understanding the mechanism of trauma, or how is it that trauma affects development. And I call it trauma dynamics because fluid dynamics is when we study what happens when water flows through a system. And so trauma dynamics would be what happens when we study how trauma flows through a system. And so there are three concepts that are in this visual. There are actually six, but I'm only going to share three today. And the first is going to be the symbol of the drop of water, which I'm hoping you will hold in your mind, as this is a metaphor for thinking about trauma. The ripples are the metaphor for reminders, and the splash that you see right here is the metaphor for ruptures in safety and protection. And so let's get into these concepts. And so if you go to a longer ripple effect training, you'll also see that I often describe trauma as an overwhelming wave, because if you think about it as an experience of danger, and you think about what happens when you're under a wave, and I think, like if you were there, what happens is that your brain and body open up, and they basically say something like, remember this moment. And remember this moment, because if you happen to escape, remembering will help you survive better. And so we start off by really thinking this is both incredibly adaptive at a species level and at a survival level, and can be very inconvenient because your body may sense danger to help you out at times when maybe the danger is not as severe as you would want that whole thing. So it's sort of a thank you, body, for remembering, but also sometimes, oh, no, thank you, because, I think this can interfere with my ability to be present. And so I just, thinking about this idea of being under a wave of danger. And I also just want you to think about memory being tricky, because sometimes your brain can remember, but your body can blip to protect you in ways. We can dissociate, or we can be little. And when we're little, memory consolidates in some very interesting ways. So this concept, which I'll read here, comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and really the work of Robert Pinus. And it's that a traumatic experience consists of different traumatic moments that are encoded in the brain and body at multiple levels. And I first want to tackle this idea of what do we mean by encoding in the brain and body. And one of the best ways that I, have seen to explain this actually comes from an interview, an NPR interview with a neuropsychologist by the name of David Eagleman. And he was talking on NPR. He mentioned his own story. He said that when he was a boy, he fell from the roof of his house, and that he felt like time was passing really slowly, that he was like Alice in Wonderland in that scene in the movie where she's going down the rabbit hole and going very, very slowly, and all of these objects are going by. And so when he grew up, one of the things that he wanted to study as a researcher was what it's like to be in a near-death experience. And so he has a lab and he has research assistants, and he hooks them up to bungee cords, and they fall from, 15-story buildings. And in the NPR interview, what he said was, and just as you look at this picture, we can all think that, hey, that might not be what I would do, but it's fascinating what he said on NPR. He said, it's a trick of memory. Normally, our memories are like sieves, but when you're in a life or death moment, our memories go wide open. That's what memory is for. It's for when everything hits the fan. You want to write it down and remember it. So all of it goes to your hard drive, the clouds, the feeling of the air. Oh, look, there's a guy in a blue shirt. So when you read that back out, the experience feels like it must have taken a very long time. Normally, the trivial stuff gets dumped, but in this situation, it gets written. And then you realize how much trivial stuff there is, which makes you wonder, how do we feel if we remembered all that stuff all the time? You'd be totally consumed by memories. You'd buried. You wouldn't be able to forget it. Having an experience like this creates a surfeit of memory, too much to remember. Okay, so I hope from this you get the notion of embedding. And now we want to think about the second part of the first part of this, is that a moment, a traumatic moment, consists of different traumatic moments. And this is what Bob Pinus taught me, was that, even in a single incident trauma, like a car accident, for example, there are lots of tiny moments. So for example, in a car accident, there might be a moment when I recognize that I might be in danger. And what if what I noticed was that there was a large truck in my rearview mirror? You might all see how what my body is doing is it's encoding trucks and danger together. And then there might be a moment where I swerve my car. And in that moment, maybe movement gets encoded and embedded in my body, as that gets embedded as dangerous. Okay. And, oh, sure, that would be great, Denise. Sorry, I just got a question in the chat and I wanted to answer that. Yes, you can do that. She was asking if we wanted to let people talk, and I just would say yes. So I'm just going to go back to this idea of, swerving and letting people kind of, as I swerved, that might get embedded into my body as, some kind of indicator of danger. And years later, if I went on Disney's teacup ride, I might be noticing that I didn't like the ride. And it might be helpful for me to think, oh, perhaps that is because, when the car swerved, I remember that. Or maybe I wouldn't be able to piece it together. But I hope that what you're getting is this idea that there might be multiple moments. And of course, we all know the moment when you hear sirens. So that years later, when I hear sirens, that might take me back to the moment. There might be another moment as well. So let me just check. All righty. So apparently somebody's hand was raised. And so I am just going to pause for a moment. Denise, apparently you may have a question.
Sorry, I don't. I hit it by accident. My apologies. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's not a problem. The reason we were pausing is because I did note that, this talk is for you guys. And so I want to make it as relevant as possible and to make sure to tailor it to what you do. But thank you. So I'm just going to continue because I want to make sure that you guys understand what I would consider these core trauma concepts. So I I also want to highlight that there are often delayed moments, which can be really tricky. And this is sort of the complexity of trauma, is that you can imagine that you have these moments, and then 5 years later, something might happen so that you get new information suggesting that you are in greater danger. And what happens is that you have a sixth moment, because trauma is really about understanding, about thinking about dangers and appraisals of danger and how danger gets rooted in your body. And this is not a fun example, but it is the clearest one that I have in my learning of when this has happened. So Bob Pinus, Melissa Breimer, a lot of other colleagues have studied, because Melissa is also the head of the Terrorism and Disaster Branch of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They've studied things like disasters, but also mass shootings. And that one of the things, that's where we can kind of clearly see that sometimes you get a sixth moment. And so we can also understand that, for example, part of the experience of danger is what they might call proximity to danger. How close do you feel to danger? And let's say that we were all together in a room, and unfortunately, I have a breakdown and I am a shooter. The people who are closer to me are closer to danger, and they might have more symptoms than the people in the back of the room. If you knew somebody that got shot, you might be closer to danger and you might have more symptoms. If there was somebody who looked like you might be closer to danger, because you might think, wow, that they look just like me and I was there too. Now, this is why I'm sort of doing this awful example. 5 years later, you might get information that suggested perhaps that I was targeting your cultural group, or that I was targeting people with your hair color. And that might cause you to recognize that you were in greater danger than you might have thought you were previously. And that's moment 6, where you get new information that suggested that back then you were in danger and your symptoms might return. And they might come back and they might even be stronger. And many people, the reason I'm sharing this is that many people will say, but it was years ago. Why am I having so many problems? And what we would want to say is, well, that's because you're recognizing that things were really scary and that you were in danger. And that's the body's response to danger. And so how can we be kind to ourselves and really think about that it makes sense that when we feel like we're, under danger in the line of fire, that our body, produces stress hormones, does things to kind of amp up. And so we have very understandable symptoms. So this is an example from Gabriel's life. And again, if this affects your body, I want you to just to remember to move your bodies, because as we even read this, it can bring up lots of memories for us, or lots of feelings, lots of stress hormones as well. So after Gabriel's dad lost his job, his mom started working and his dad began drinking, and his parents argued often. And on Gabriel's 3rd birthday, his dad came home drunk. Gabriel was playing with toy cars that Troy, his mom's boss, had given him for his birthday. His dad was furious. He picked up the cars and threw them against the wall. And when his mom tried to stop him, he threw her against the wall and he began kicking her. He accused her of flirting with Troy. Gabriel was screaming. His mom grabbed Gabriel and ran to the bedroom. She locked the door and crawled into the closet with Gabriel, and they could hear his dad breaking glass and furniture. Okay. So this is one of the experiences that Gabriel and his family went through. Okay, and it is a difficult experience. And looking through the lens of that core concept, I don't know if we can see this, but there were multiple moments. And so if you think about it, this was a moment when Gabriel and his parents were under the wave, they were in danger. And that there was the moment when dad came home. And just imagine the things that might be associated with that. Feet stomping, keys trying to get into the door. There might be a moment when, Gabriel became aware that dad had been drinking. Just think about the sounds, the smells associated with that. There was, of course, a moment of arguing. There was a moment when dad threw the toy against the wall, a moment when dad threw mom and kicked her, and then a moment when they hid in the closet. And just think about the body position, being in the closet. These are all moments. And then there are other moments, of course. And so at each moment, we might think about what is being encoded in the brain and body as associated with danger. Now, not everyone needs to have this information, but I, as a mental health practitioner, when I'm working with families as a trauma therapist, if mom can share this with me without being overwhelmed, it can be incredibly helpful. Because, for example, I worked with a child where this is pretty much their story. And when they came in, they put all of the dollhouse furniture in the bathroom. Now, if you don't have the story, you know, as many people said, it is, he's too little to really know how to play. And what I would say is actually, this isn't play, but he's trying to show that there was a moment where they were just trying to put everything up against that bathroom door. And it was chaotic and it was scary. And actually, his play is not an indication of his developmental level. It's an indication, it's a moment of fear that he's sharing. And if, to the degree that I don't know his story, it's hard for me to catch and hold it. Now, when a drop falls, there are ripples. And that's the metaphor for reminders. And so this is really the idea that trauma can generate distressing reminders that can affect a child's life and functioning long after an event has ended. And as you were listening to this, you know, you might think, what are some of the reminders for Gabriel? And you can pop them in the Q&A. Just, you know, take a moment and think about what might be Gabriel's reminders. What might you see, right? Given what he went through and all of those moments, right? And just take a moment and think. Yeah, here come some things. Yep, the closet, glass breaking, toy cars, absolutely. Yep. What else? Yelling, people being angry, the smell of alcohol, absolutely. Yeah. So these are some of the things that can be reminders, right? From this experience, what you just said, glass breaking, right? And in fact, there's a beautiful article that Alicia Lieberman wrote with Julie Kaplow about a woman who heard, you know, in a very serious incident in her life, the glass broke. And it was when someone threw a rock through her window years later that it brought back that memory. Yeah. And so you guys are coming through with more, somebody coming home. Yeah. So you can see all of these things, anger on people. When his mom is sad might be a reminder of that. People drinking, his birthday, right? So getting gifts, lots of things could become reminders for Gabriel. You know, his own heart beating fast. We often don't think about the interoceptive body-based cues, you know, being in the closet. And that's where, like, if, for example, he's hunched down in the closet and one day in class, we're doing some kind of activity that requires that same position, he might hate it, right? In the same way that somebody whose car is swerved might hate the teacup ride. And so just thinking about how it makes so much sense that his body might not like that position. Now, of course, we're just hypothesizing. And so we would be wanting to watch his body and behavior to see, is it actually a reminder for him? But if it was, it would make so much sense. And even when we think about feelings in his body, what I have learned from the children and families is that, you know, for example, we think feelings, but feelings live in the body. And so I'm going like this because that's like the feeling of frustration. And what if when this was happening, you wanted to make it stop? Because we think about at different ages, young children, you know, when they're very little, they believe their parents are all powerful. And then, you know, as they get a little older, they start to think that they're all powerful. And so we've seen some young kids who are like, I should have been able to make them stop because they have this kind of belief in their you know, omnipotence. And so there's that feeling of, I should have done it, and I couldn't. And Peter Levine, who's an adult trauma therapist, talks about, you know, what gets rooted in the body is also movement that you wanted to do that you couldn't do at the moment. Now, we might imagine that if the feeling of frustration is what I would say, it's your kryptonite, it's your reminder, it's, you know, the ripple that you hit. What happens when you feel frustrated again, maybe in preschool, because you can't do something like write your name? It's not the same situation at all. But if you remember, A, acknowledge that, B, the body remembers. And when you're little, you don't understand that this is the feeling of frustration. You just know that, oh, the last time I felt this way in my body, really bad things happen. And so it makes sense that we see dysregulated affect and dysregulated behavior in the face of that. Okay, so we could spend a long time just thinking about this, but this is the mechanism. And I often use a metaphor where people will say to me, can you fix the child? Can you cure them? Can you reduce their behavior problems? And what I would say is, if we're looking at a medical model, you probably have the wrong model. And could we maybe think like trauma, like asthma, where you don't necessarily fix or cure it, you manage it. And what you acknowledge is that when the body is exposed to pollen, you have a reemergence of symptoms. And that's what reminders are, is that they are the pollen. And that when a child is in a reminder-rich environment, you can expect a return in symptoms. Okay. So let's just also think about, I call them reminders. Some people call them triggers. You can have different words, but I call them reminders just to remind myself that there's more than just trauma reminders or trauma triggers, and that reminders are often connected. And so there are also reminders of loss and reminders of change, that things are very different from how they were. And when we think about a loss reminder, imagine that, Gabriel's in a class and they're reading the story of Corduroy. It's a cute story. And Gabriel's mind jumps to, my daddy gave me a teddy bear. And then his mind jumps to, my daddy is not with us and I miss him. Can you guys feel that heaviness happening off of a neutral stimulus? And what's happened is that the book has gone from being a lovely little book to also being a loss reminder. And then it's possible that Gabriel's mind might jump to, he's not with us because bad things happened and he was really scary. And then in that moment, maybe the book is also a trauma reminder. Now, then what you might see is dysregulated affect and behavior that the grownups would say, he switched for no reason. And what I might say is, it's not always possible to understand the chains, the ways that people make connections, the ways our mind jumps. But could we honor that perhaps there's a reason, that it might not be for no reason? And it might not just be because this child has a genetic condition. It might be because they also have an experience layered on top of that. So I've done 3 concepts from here, and now I just want to quickly throw up this ball, which I will not do full honor to, but hopefully it will be helpful to you all. I call this our integrated web. And so this is really us, and where it comes from is really taking a deep dive into the research and looking at, when people have had experiences of interpersonal trauma, what do we see and what are the domains of functioning that might be affected? And if you think about how trauma, our responses to trauma and danger are rooted in our neurobiology, trauma affects your sense of safety. It can, it kind of affects your ability to regulate your emotions. Kids would say it makes you feel icky and it's hard to stop feeling icky, right? It can affect your relationships, but it's kind of, it doesn't capture the full kind of depth of this to have it as a static list, because all of these domains are interconnected. And so if you think about it, stress and trauma can kind of ripple through your body. And let me just give you an example. It's kind of a silly example just to think about how we all have webs. And I'm often thinking about how is my body in a state of alarm or a state of calm? Because if you imagine this web going red hot right now, if I'm in a state of alarm, I am fundamentally kind of doing things in a different way. And so the example that I typically use to help people to understand how stress can ripple through our webs is doing a talk. And so, for example, right now, I am speaking to you and I can't see you. And that's really hard for me because I love getting visual cues from you. And so what sometimes happens for me is I worry when that happens. And my neurobiology shoots out a little, maybe stress hormones to help me out. And, I'm trying to become aware of something and I'm like, oh, darn, I'm not in my home where I have my stuffed animals lined up so I could see them. But like when you're giving a talk, typically you're aware of the people around you and you might have expectations about relationships. And so I'm just going to pretend like, what if we were in the same room together and I would be looking at you guys as I was talking? And if I'm worried because I'm thinking, oh dear, here I am, this is an important UCSF talk, I don't know how it's being received, I might start to have expectations about our relationship that are like, oh dear, they might know this, I don't know if this is working. And that can affect my sense of safety. It can affect my feeling state, my neurobiology might fire more, and it can affect my behavior. And I'm imagining that many of you might have had a time when you were doing some public speaking and you got really anxious, and that the capacity that it might affect it is our ability to be present and to give a cogent talk. And that would be because our web is on fire. And I just wanted to note that while like stress can ripple through our webs, so can healing. And so when you catch sight of a smiling face, and it's actually helping me that Petra and Eileen have these beautiful pictures of themselves, because I've been looking at their pictures, and that actually helps because they're smiling in them. And so I have different expectations of our relationship because they're sort of their images are in the same room. And so that can help us to feel better and more connected, which can help our neurobiology and affect our behavior. So I'm just hoping that I'm doing a decent enough job to help you to understand interconnections among our web kind of rapidly. And so when we think about this idea of embedded, encoded in the brain and body, and you think about a kid like Gabriel, when the drop falls, this experience is embedded in his body, and it's embedded in his web as well, right? And so when danger falls, I'm so glad that you wrote in the chat that it's working. Good. Can you see how his web is being wired so that when he bumps into reminders of dangers, toy cars, people getting angry, he goes from being calm to being in a state of alarm. And he then is paying attention to very different things. And so as we even think about what can encode as being dangerous, I won't go all the way through it, but you can do what I call a web walk. And you can say, anything that you're aware of in a moment can become a reminder. Sight, smells, sounds, taste, the weather, certain places, your own body-based reactions and feelings that live in your body can later on come to remind you of that moment. So, one little kid said that it felt like his heart was coming out of his chest. And in other times when his heart beat that fast, it was clear it was taking him right back to that moment. Certain people can be reminders when people wear certain feelings. And we think about people say, well, little kids are too little to be affected. And what we know when we work with little kids is actually they do this thing that we call social referencing, so that when they're in danger, they look at their caregivers, their loved ones' faces, as if to say, is it okay? Is it okay? And that means that some of the times they may be really good at actually encoding what I would call our danger faces. And so if I am somebody who bites my lip when things are not going well, what if my child reads that as a sign that mommy is not doing well, right? And so I just want to highlight this because, for example, in a lot of families, the children had experienced trauma and then they got safe. And they, maybe their parents made huge changes. Maybe there were other loved ones caring for them. But when COVID hit, what happened is a lot of our bodies, to put it in kid language, became funky. We became stressed. And we might have started doing things like funky face, where we were going like this. And to the degree that we weren't helping kids to understand the experience that was actually contributing to funky face, little children sometimes fill in the gaps with their own fantasies. And so they might worry, here we go again. People are getting sad. People are doing that. Oh no, it's happening again. And so our bodies under stress can be reminders, which is why I have learned in a way to sometimes decode myself when I'm working with people and to say, I'm feeling a little stressed because, and I don't want to give you TMI, too much information, because you don't need to carry my stress, but to give you an understanding of, this is one of the key things in trauma is to differentiate between then and now. And so by giving you right now, I'm really stressed because, I'm worried about people who are sick and, and I will be fine. So because I'm decoding myself so the child can differentiate between another time when people were sad and this time. I'm going to skip some of my slides, but if you go through them more slowly, what you can see is I view this web as almost a musical instrument, and you can pluck a string or you could push a note and you could say, what would a kid say to us? What would they want us to know? And so you can, of course, go to many other trauma talks and hear what many wise people might say, like Stephen Porges about neurobiology, Dan Siegel, Alan Sroof, lots of other people. But a child might say, I'm stressed all the time, so I get upset easily. And just thinking about if your body is supposed to run here, mine runs up here. And so when I get stressed, it's really hard for me to calm down. They might say, I need to move around a lot. And I would say, oh, you are so wise, because you know intuitively that when you're stressed, your body is producing cortisol and adrenaline, and some of those stress hormones are designed to make us fight or flee. And so how smart you are of the need to move. They might say, I get sick a lot. We might be like, oh yeah, absolutely. Because when you have stress hormones swirling around in your body, in particular, if you don't move, some of those stress hormones are toxic to our immune system. So it makes sense that you get sick. And they might say, when I'm stressed, I'm sensitive to body tone and posture. And that would really be taking us to the vagus nerve and recognizing that that's so true, that when we're stressed, we are more acutely perhaps aware of how is a person approaching us and how are they talking to us, as opposed to the content of what they're saying. And just to show how you can use this a little bit, how it can ripple, a child who's experienced danger might say, I expect that bad things happen. And so I expect that people might hurt me, that you can't trust others. And I might even have expectations of myself, that I'm not lovable, that I'm not capable, that I can't do anything. So these are hard things for us to think about kids holding. But I want us to understand this because there are ways that we can repair this as well. Okay, so I'm just going to skip a little bit because I'm getting nervous about my time, because I also want to leave time for questions, but I also want to cover a little bit more. And so just thinking about when we're working with somebody, are they in a state of alarm or a state of calm? Is their web on fire? And if so, how might that affect what they're taking in? And whether they're hearing your good your good words, how might that affect their expectations of whether they see you as helpful and whether they feel safe in relationship to you or not? Now, this splash is this concept of ruptures in safety and protection. And this idea of, we thought we were safe, but we're not safe. And that in early childhood, we have this myth of the protective shield, that grownups are all powerful. The clearest example of this that I find still funny is that when my son was 2 years old, he thought I was all powerful, because that's just the way 2 years old can be. So he thought it was my fault when it rained on his birthday. But you might think that if he could think that it was my fault when it rained on his birthday, it would absolutely be my fault if something bad happened to him. And so then we think about, what do you do if you have, this is very important, the concept of danger. So this little boggle beast here, that's the creature from one of my stories, danger without protection versus danger with protection and connection. And so when we believe that little kids are too young, we often don't talk to them about what's going on. And they often feel stranded, fear without connection and protection. And then you think about, well, how do you adapt? And one thing that you might do is you might need to fight. It's very adaptive. Somebody needs to fight the danger. Another thing that you might do is you might need to flee. You might need to run away. And then another thing is, if you can't fight and you can't flee, perhaps it's protective to dissociate or freeze, right? And then another pattern is maybe you have to friend, which might mean, looking for other adults, grabbing your friends and grouping together, or subjugating yourself to this monster and saying, I'm tiptoeing on eggshells around this being, and I'm just making sure that they're happy, but maybe I'm not attending to myself. Now, I wrote a book that I don't have time to read, but I hope that you guys will check out the link, and there's a free PDF. And in this book, it's on this website. In this book, what I did was I actually went through all of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and I coded them. And then I actually did a kind of a weird factor analysis where I took every symptom and I made sure that it lived in an animal. And so that we can see kind of what are the different patterns. And so I'm going to skip a little bit of this because there's a free webinar called When We Are Scared that you guys can watch, and you can see what I'm talking about. It's really about what the animals help us to learn. But what I'm hoping that you're also even getting from today's more brief talk is when we ask the question of, do they remember? What we might say is actually that we're asking the wrong question. And that we might want to say to people, when we think about little kids, it's not whether they remembered, it's what they learned. And that's what we're trying to do, is by acknowledging that their bodies remember and learn something, and we make that connection, we can hold that it wasn't just brain learning, it was full body learning, and we can help them to learn something different. And if you look at the webinar, you can see that there are, you can see how these animals like elephant is holding the avoidance symptoms. You can see how, this is the link to the webinar. So I'm just going to I'm going to end with this little thing. I just want to say that as we look at, I'm going to pause and regulate myself because what's happening is I'm running against time. There are many things that when we acknowledge we can do, and some of you are part of that. So when we recognize the stress and trauma here, we can have supportive NICUs. We can have support for early childhood daycare consultations who are working. And we can start to advocate for mental health at an early age, which is really critical and important. Now, if you look at Gabriel, what we can also do is we can think about how his teachers thought that he had ADHD. And if you look at the story and you see the character of Rabbit, and just think about rabbits, what you'll notice is that Rabbit carries the symptoms of ADHD. But if you use Rabbit's ears as antenna, and you say that Rabbit is constantly surveying the world for danger, you might think of Rabbit as a danger detector. And just think about Rabbit. It might not be that Rabbit has problems paying attention. It might be that Rabbit is paying attention to danger. And if you have a choice between paying attention to danger or paying attention to danger out there or paying attention to your ABCs, you're going to pay attention to danger. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that many of you have the ability to slow things down. And when a kid comes in like Gabriel and is having a lot of challenges, you have the ability to think about, do we go back to this first theory, or do we slow things down and say, we need a more complete picture? We need to hold that it's not what's wrong with him, it's what happened to him. And that maybe some of the reactions that his body is having will make total sense given his history. So I'm going to pause there just to invite more questions. We have about 6 minutes. I'm sorry, Eileen, that I went over. I just wanted to do that one slide because I thought it was critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Chandra, for the fantastic presentation. I feel like I was taken to a journey working vicariously with you with so many unique families. I also see that there are some questions in the queue, so I'll turn it to you, Chandra, to answer these questions.
Yeah. So one of them is what helps decrease reminders or triggers to lessen the frequency of feeling unsafe? Is there something that helps lessen the reminders over time and leads to healing? What I would say is the first thing is really having accompaniment on your journey. And so you probably all have worked with a child who's been bitten by a dog, right? And you probably know that most children who've been bitten by a dog, they know their story. And so what they'll say is things like, I'm scared of dogs because once I was bitten. And I remember a little kid who was like, see, and he showed me his scars. And what they have is they have their story. And so the first thing they have is a deep acknowledgement that there is nothing wrong with their fear because it comes from somewhere. And that, if we think about one of the core of trauma work is acceptance, and that you balance acceptance with change. That phrasing comes from Marshall Linehan, the developer of dialectical behavior therapy. And so when you are little, though, we say that the grown-ups are the co-creators of memory. And so it is the ability of your grown-ups to kind of say, yeah, you worry. You worry because you had this experience. And that's the first step. And then you can start to have new experiences where we help you differentiate. This is different. Now, let's just think about people who've had a really scary experience with anger. What would it be like if they could say, I worry when people get angry because I'm like Gabriel. And when people get angry, I worry. And it makes all the sense. And what we would say is, what do we want you to learn about anger? And so actually the way that you learn about how to deal with reminders is by having new experiences. And so anytime someone gets mad, if that's your kryptonite, that's a chance for us to show you that when people get angry, we don't go away. When we get angry, we don't hurt people. When we get angry, we can repair. And that's how you learn to kind of deal with the reminder, because it's both acknowledged that it makes sense and you're having new learning around when this thing happens, there are other things that can happen. And it's brilliant to focus on it in early childhood because that's when your template is being formed. And that's when your brain, you have 1 billion neurons that you're gonna prune away, but you are ripe for new learning. And so to the degree that we can get in there early, we have a 0 to 3 slogan that says the babies can't wait. I know a lot of you are looking at adverse childhood experiences. We are seeing routinely that it's, people talk about 4 or more. We're seeing that it's 4 or more before the age of 5. And so I know I kind of went on a little journey with your question, but I hope that sort of answered your question and maybe took us a little one somewhere else. Any other questions?
I do have a question. Our clinic collects the history of in utero exposure to abuse or domestic violence. And I wonder, from your experience, what is the importance of having that information? And once we have that, how to address that and how much it would impact the children's development if they don't remember anything?
Oh, that is such a good question. All right. So I'm, one of my challenges is, so when we work with families, we do work with some families where children have been removed. And what I want to say is that, unfortunately, a lot of times that is the only information that their next caregivers get, is that they get the information about their in utero exposure. And what I would say is there's an unintended consequence of that, which is that the grownups tend to say, that's the experience that I'm holding. That's why this kid is messed up. And they take very much of a neurobiological rationale. And I'm like, yeah. And this is a child who's had 4 different homes. This child has expectations that you're going to leave. And that if you hold a more nuanced view of this, you might understand that the child gets anxious every time that you go away because they're not sure you're going to come back. And so I think about how useful it is, Eileen, because it can help us to understand that this child had a rough start because they had, imagine, like, shrink yourself down to the size of the child and think what it's like to detox when you're coming into the world, how hard it is. And so if we take that and we say, we want to woo your body back to safety, and we want to understand that because of your experience, you may have things that trigger you, things that remind you of that feeling of being so out of control in your body. So how do I woo you back to safety? And, I want to understand that this can leave a trace and that you're remarkably flexible, that neurobiology is incredibly plastic and your experiences matter. And so if I've only got a view that that's it, I'm missing a lot of things that I could do that would restore your sense of safety. I might be able to note that you feel really worried when people get loud and that you're not quite sure what to do with yourself. And so that I might then, I hope you notice that what's shifting is my body. So my empathy of you, my understanding of your history changes my vocal tone and body posture. And that's what hits the vagus nerve. And that's what woos a person back to safety. That's why in infant mental health, grown-up attributions have always been so critically important. Yeah, so what about reminders are, what about when the reminders are nightmares every night? So I don't like to go to sleep. Yeah, I mean, I think what I would want to do, that's a good question that came through, James. I would want to slow that down. And I would actually say, I would maybe put that on the right-hand side of the triangle and say, this kid has reminders. How do we understand that? Right? And so what can we acknowledge? Right? Can we acknowledge that maybe nighttime was scary? For some kids, that's when bad things happen. For some kids, that's when people went poof. And might we even say to a kid that in some of the places or sometimes in our homes, there were lots of loud noises and scary things happen at night and you worry. And then as a therapist, I'm going to show you a picture on my screen. Let me just say, because I think this is a helpful metaphor. I didn't get to everything I wanted to cover. All right, I found my screen. As grownups, we often, if you think about the metaphor of playing baseball, we often like to pitch. And I just want us to think about how children, in terms of nightmares, they're often looking for an available mind or heart, and that we have, we want to be there with curiosity. And we want to hold that behavior or nightmares has meaning and that it's communication. And that sometimes what happens, though, is that we have a competing agenda, getting you to sleep, whatnot, socializing your behavior. And what happens is sometimes our agenda interferes with our curiosity, right? And that it's really important in the work that we do that we think about, when do we pitch and when do we catch? And I was hoping to read you a story called You Weren't With Me, but you can actually go on YouTube and you can read it, because it's an example of times when grownups actually opened the door to what is inside a kid, to fears and worries. And that's how we help them. And if you like the story, you might also go on YouTube and you might check out Holden Pot, because Holden Pot offers the metaphor of a lidded pot, also thinking about all of the things that are inside our bodies, which links up to the ACE study in terms of like, if this is my body, and oh, you can't even see it because it's a cup. And if I lit it in some ways, and if the heat's on high and the lid is on tight, I pay for it in my body, right? Because I've got a story inside my body that burns. And so part of what we're trying to do in trauma-informed systems is turn down the heat, help families to find better safety for themselves and for each other, and to help people unlit it so that they're not carrying these stories alone. And so I hope, without going all over the place, just to really think about how we're helping people to talk about them. Now, somebody's talking, Galaxy, you wrote, is it better to talk through the ACE or to move on to the next step without rehashing the episode? Wow. In infant mental health, we have an answer, which is a very frustrating answer, but the answer is it depends. And I think it depends on your role. It depends on where they are. When somebody tells me about something, I think of them as looking for an available mind or an available heart. And they're trusting me with like a precious pearl. And so when somebody shares something, I think about how I want you to feel like you don't have to be alone with this, that we as fellow community members have this. But I also really want us to broaden our conceptualization of ACEs. And I didn't get to everything I wanted to, but I'm going to share one more slide because your question allows me to. But if you think about Bronfenbrenner's model, come on, where Bronfenbrenner taught us that a child lives in an embedded context and lives in a community and lives in a society and culture, I want you to notice that all the ACEs are in the layer of the family. And that we also want to think about what we call, adverse community experiences, sociocultural ACEs. And what I also, so for Gabriel's family, they experience poverty, racism, persistent inequities, and immigration stress. And then we want to think about what I would call atrocious cultural experiences, which are the original ACEs. So why did these things happen? What happened in history to their people? What is the way that why is it that we trust them this way with all of this racism? And so we want to really broaden our lens and just really honor the original ACEs. And remember, trauma is about acknowledge. And so the metaphor is that when you're looking at this, if you're squeezed from the outside, I will pop, and I might fight with those who are closest to me. It is absolutely important to address the family ACEs because they're most proximate to the child. But when we talk about this, when we hold this, I have to acknowledge that oftentimes things happened because of the forces that squeezed your family. And so I do this work really with a historical sociocultural perspective as well, which I don't think that I have done enough honor, because I can't do it all in 1 hour. But when you say, is it better to talk through the ACEs? I think, yes, it is better. And I think we also want to find opportunities to acknowledge kind of what history has done to their people and to their family. You have asked also a question about how we help families address and be aware of medical trauma. I added a slide. There is actually, there's a number of ways. So I know that Alicia has been involved with CalQuick, as has Petra. And there is also something called the Pediatric Healthcare Toolbox. And I will send around updated slides with that link. But just when you're thinking about pediatric trauma, you can go to this www.healthcaretoolbox.org, and they have a number of very great concrete tools that you can use with families in the pediatric healthcare setting as well.
Thank you again so much.